I'm very pleased to be here presenting on behalf of Jill, who is online with her camera on. Hi, Jill. And our research associate, Laura Jarvis-King. Some of the early findings from our project looking at food manufacturing and adoption of technology. Well, this is a project that has been funded by both the Productivity Institute in one phase and Digital Futures of Work Research Centre in another phase, both of which are ESRC funded centres in the UK. And we've also been sort of partnering with the Institute for the Future of Work. I haven't put you on here, Abby, because I haven't signed the slides off with you. And there are other members of the research team who, Alejandro is one in the room, who've also contributed to the project at various points. So, you've probably, for anyone who's been in the tech sessions, you've probably kind of had a grounding in some of this before, so I won't belabor the point around technology. But essentially what we're interested in here is Industry 4.0, which is the combination of automation, robotics, and digital technologies in manufacturing. So really, there's a series of technologies that tend to be grouped together here to when people use the term Industry 4.0, or as is now the policy debates, Industry 5.0. But really what we're seeing is a resurgence of a number of old debates. So these are really about whether these technologies are resulting in job displacement, creation, augmentation, intensification. And it's really the old debates around, is it going to lead to technological unemployment versus radical job transformation? Really what's happening in a lot of these debates is a primary focus on the impact on jobs. And with algorithmic management side of things, it's often a focus on control. And there's been less focus today on rationale like productivity and how that affects adoption of digital technologies. In the project, we're adopting a social shaping of technology approach, which is really the assumption that technologies have a materiality, but they can be shaped both in the design and implementation phases. And they are obviously affected in their implementation by existing technological infrastructure, political and managerial organizational practices as well. We started this project looking to try and understand what was happening in manufacturing. A lot of the literature on digital technologies and algorithmic management has tended up till now. There's obviously a plethora of papers coming out in the last few years, but a lot has often focused on platforms, particularly in relation to the impact on labor and the flexibility of labor. And this often looks at kind of the role of digital platforms in terms of disintermediating the employer-employee relationship and the increasing precarity that comes as a result. I'll highlight, but I won't dive too much into. There's obviously quite a substantive body of work now emerging on how technology adoption does vary by country, based on, for both robotics, automation, and digital technologies, based on sort of the institutional system that exists and the various mechanisms that exist to shape its implementation. So the framing that we're using for this project is that we're really interested in understanding how we can understand variation in technology adoption and implementation, really drawing on three different, so we want to understand decision-making around technology, how this is shaped by the skills that firms have access to, that includes digital skills, but also the skills of the more general workforce, and the employment strategies that they're adopting. So this is really the reliance on flexible labor. What kind of labor sourcing strategies or labor deployment strategies that they're using, and how is that shaping when and how they adopt technology. In terms of food manufacturing, I mean, the reason we're focusing on it is because it's one of the largest manufacturing employers in the UK. That remains. It tends to have relatively weak capital intensity, so it hasn't adopted a lot of technology. It's not at the forefront of tech change, and tends to be kind of relatively low-skilled, low-paid work. Often over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, there's been an increasing reliance on migrant labor, often coming through the EU, and that will have been dramatically restructured based on Brexit. And this is particularly in sections of the industry that are, have seasonal product demand. So we know that Brexit will have had a huge impact. We know COVID's potentially had a huge impact. We know the cost of living crisis and rising energy costs, etc., will also impact on the industry. So we theorize that this would create the perfect conditions for strong rationale to adopt technology as a way of kind of compensating for increasing labor costs with the rise in minimum wages and potential labor and skill shortages that might be existing as a result of Brexit and COVID. So this is obviously ongoing. It's an ongoing project. We're very deep into the empirical research, which is fantastic because I love going into a factory. Um, we are currently completing 8 company cases. We've done 6. We've kind of got, or we 5 are completed. 1 is almost completed, and then there are 2 that are kind of ongoing across different products and markets of the food manufacturing industry. What this has involved typically is interviews with a series of managers involved in tech change, including HR, engineering, operations, and site visits, so we can actually see the technology in practice. This has kind of been involved. So we tended to do group interviews here. So we've done 28 qualitative interviews with managers, often in groups, with 38 different individuals in leadership roles covering production, operation, HR, tech, and engineering. We've also engaged with a number of key stakeholders, like technology providers is one of the key ones. And this builds on a previous project, which was funded by Digit. So this is the TPI side that spoke to a number of food stakeholders, including employer associations, trade associations, unions, just to get a sense of the broader conditions of the industry. So just to give you a bit of a flavor of the, some of the findings that we're working on, it's very kind of empirically oriented. So please forgive me for the perhaps lack of theorization at this point. But what we're trying to do is essentially map out the variation in sort of tech adoption across our cases. So in one case, we have kind of a sweet company. They are setting up a brand new factory. This new factory is, incredibly automated, adopting AI, decision-making, visioning systems. It's for one of their product lines, and they're using that sort of factory as a way of filtering technology back into their existing site. We can really see in this case the tensions with the impact of pre-existing technology infrastructure. So in the original site, they talk about having machines that are over 100 years old and having members of staff who have skills specifically to replace parts that they can no longer purchase outside of their firm to keep those machines running. Whereas the other factory is pretty much Industry 4.0. If you ever go to a Siemens show or watch one of their kind of promotional videos, it looks very similar to that. In this case, we really saw minimal agency work. So it was really used to fill gaps or for specialist skills. All staff were employed. They tended to have a very long tenure, so they were considered a good employer. Things like they have their own works council, that kind of thing, which is very unusual in the UK context. And they didn't seem to see any sort of reskilling or skill gaps. They didn't perceive any issues with this transition to the new technology. The key thing for them was that they were, the factory is pretty much completely automated. So they would have maybe 2 teams of 6 workers, 1 manager, 3 or 4 maintenance technicians for the new robotic systems, but that was about it. In terms of poultry, what we really saw, poultry is a very mechanized industry. It's also incredibly heavily reliant on flexible agency work. So what we really saw here with this firm in particular was that they were massively affected by Brexit and COVID, and they have adopted a significant investment in technology strategy as a way of upgrading some of the work that they do, deliberately redesigning some of their operator roles to make them more highly skilled, and to reduce their reliance or reduce the number of operators that they're looking for. They've essentially moved away from pretty much a European sourcing strategy of migrant labor towards a more local labor sourcing strategy. And they've really focused on automated and robotics technology. One of the interesting things about this firm is that they have been sort of like experimenting with digital technology and adoption of Internet of Things. But for them, the real challenge has been working out how to sell the productivity benefits of digital technology within the wider firm. We've seen a sandwich company. So that's quite interesting. Again, I would recommend, it's been a really great experience seeing all these firms. None of them has put me off eating the items of food that were produced. So that's always a good sign. But the sandwich firm was probably the most labor intensive. There were hands at every stage of the factory process. So this was kind of a very nice contrast to some of the others, which were highly mechanized. They had 2 factories. One was more reliant on agency. The other really utilized like local sourcing strategies. With this particular firm, they didn't use agency work necessarily, but they did use flexible working hours. So recruiting people, recruiting typically a feminized workforce, and flexing their labor, particularly over sort of like school holidays and Christmases and things like that. With this firm, they were on the cusp of making the switch, and they were also looking at building a new factory blueprint site. So this is one of the ones we're planning to touch back with at the end of this year to see where they are with this journey, and sort of map if it's a similar example of tech adoption that we see in the sweets company, where the new factory is far more technologically advanced and automated. We've also seen a cheese manufacturer. So here was a really interesting mix of both automated robotics and digital technologies. And this is a really interesting case in terms of some of the challenges with digital technology, particularly for firms that have been traditionally more craft or hand skill oriented. One of the challenges this firm was explaining was trying to ensure that the reliability of the data, but also ensuring the quality of the product. How can you learn to trust the data? How do you learn what data to collect? And it really kind of highlighted for us some of the challenges with food as kind of a product that changes over time. It's much more challenging in terms of automating data collection. For example, one of the things that they described was that when you have a vat full of milk and you're trying to turn that into sort of curd, how do you measure throughout the vat to ensure that the test that you're taking for the salt content, for example, is the same throughout the vat that you have, because that will affect the taste of the cheese. And one of the key metrics in food is obviously to ensure kind of a standardized taste across the batch that you're producing. With this, one of the things we have seen across the project is that where agency work is inserted into work processes is often at the lower skilled, particularly for operating roles, is often at the lower skilled side, so packing. So agency work tends to be more affected by, for example, automation of packing lines with robotics, which is a key area where tech is being adopted in manufacturing. So here, agency tended to be used in sort of packing, but they were also used in and around the ramp up to Christmas, because cheese is a seasonal product, or some cheeses are a seasonal product. And we really saw kind of that they were hoping with adoption of technology and sort of like the combination of digitalization and robotics, they were hoping to reduce their reliance on that and reduce some of their labor cost. And finally, black pudding. So the Black Pudding Company was a really interesting one because most of these firms were sort of large, privately owned firms in the UK context. The Black Pudding Company was actually a medium-sized firm, but was one of the more advanced in terms of digital technologies. They've actually invested a significant amount in technology, utilized a number of kind of technology adoption programs in the UK context. But even then, there was still this reluctance to rely on sort of data for decision making. So they were in a process where they were trialing running both kind of like paper and digital formats as a way of testing its kind of like trustworthiness. They tended to rely on it. In terms of agency work, they had less reliance on agency work, which obviously is a key indicator in the cases that we've done, that the lower the reliance on agency work, the easier it has been to adopt technology. There's obviously a tension there between the flexibility of human labor and the fixed nature of automation and robotics technologies. So they tended to find this particular firm had like built a very good local sourcing strategy, and so didn't seem to be suffering from any of the issues related to the labor shortages that had been broadly sweeping the industry in general. But they did say that one of the impacts of this adoption was a need to upskill the existing workforce, particularly for engineering, maintenance, robotics skill sets. So, your robotics and digital skill sets. And one of the key things they talked about was finding the right kind of skills in the organization. So I'll skip over, we are still ongoing. And essentially, we're in this process of figuring out how we can explain and theorize the variation that we're seeing, and whether that, can we explain the relationships between the three characteristics? But I'll leave it there.